so much for being here with us tonight. It's a very special and occasion to have Dr. Stavros Paspalas giving this incredible lecture for us about a topic we don't know much. Also, it's a very important sort of occasion to which marks the collaboration between the Department of Greek Studies, the St. Catherine's Church at Mascot, and Father Athanasios, who took the initiative for this meeting, and we're very grateful to him because he has developed his parish into a sort of a small panvidacterion, a University of Constantinople, just with these incredible things that he is doing, and thank him so much for his, he will become the Photius, or the great of the Greek Orthodox community here in Sydney. So we thank you, Father Athanasios, as well, but especially I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight. I know it's the end in the morning. We have Andrew from Athens, I guess. Andrew, are you in Athens? From all over the globe. So as you see, Zoom abolishes the tyranny of distance. So thank you so much for being here, as I said again tonight, and our postgraduate students from Sydney University. My name is Professor Vrasidas Karalis. I'm teaching Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Sydney. And this topic tonight that Dr. Paspalas will be talking about, which is about the medieval monuments, or the monuments of medieval Athens, which is probably, as you see, one of the most important dimensions of so that the history of the city, and one of the most important and hidden treasures as well of the social experience in the city itself, and the way that you can confront it, it confronts its own past today. And it's a topic also that we hope that will instigate a lot of interest as well, not simply amongst the archaeologists, but the people who have actually lived in Athens. They want to know more about the social experience of the city, and the energy that essentially gives it the life that it makes it so attractive and so interesting. So without further ado, I would like to thank, first of all our students for being here tonight, and all those who participate generally in the lectures that are organized by the Australian Archaeological Institute of Athens. Dr. Paspalas, as you know, is the director of the institute since 2020, and he's the person who continues with so valiantly and so, I would say, imaginatively as well, the legacy of the late Professor Alexandri Kambitoglu, to whom we are all indebted, and we all actually feel grateful about what he has done for the Greek presence of the Greek culture in Australia. So Dr. Paspalas, as you know, has taken a lot of field work in Zagora, on Andros, on the island of Andros, Toroni in Chalkidiki, and on the island of Kythera. And as you know, his major interests range from the early Iron Age Aegean through to the ancient Greek ceramics and onto Greek Achaemenidean relations. I think you mean with the Persians, Stavro, eh?
Indeed,
yes. We defeated them, eh? It's just the marathon battle a few last week. Forget it. Just they're done, and are on retreat now. They will be back in 10 years. So thank you, sort of a kind of, and Dr. Paspalas also works now, has led the University of Sydney and the Australian Archaeological Institute in Athens for so many years, and he has started this incredible collaboration with the University of Sydney's Archaeology Department and the intensive programs in Athens classical archaeology. I would like to, Stavro, thank you so much for this opportunity to listen to you. I mean, exploring this topic, which is not very well known, as I said, and needs further elaboration. When I was a student, I wrote a whole essay, a long essay. We used to write 25,000 master's work for each subject at the University of Athens on the poems written during the Middle Ages about living in Athens. I see no Athens anywhere, as the famous Bishop Choniatis used to say then. And that happened just before the Fourth Crusade, which destroyed the fabric of the Byzantine Empire. Stavro, we are all ears, as we say in Greek. Είμαστε όλοι αυτιά. Listen to what you're going to say about the medieval Athens. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vrasidas, and thanks to you and to Father Athanasios for this collaboration this evening. I'm very honored to be here on this platform and very pleased to present this public lecture to everybody who's participating this evening. I'll just share my screen. I believe everybody should be able to see it, I hope.
Yes.
There is no doubt that when most of us today think of ancient Greece, our mind will immediately present the mental image of the Acropolis of Athens with its 4 5th century buildings. The Parthenon, the Propylaia. One moment, why is the... I'll stop share screening for a moment because the slides are not progressing for whatever reason.
Stavros, if they don't seem to progress with your mouse click, there should be, if you hover your mouse over the lower left corner, it should highlight an arrow and you should be able to progress them from there.
Ah, I see. Okay, I'll try that. Here we go again. Okay, so when we think of ancient Greece, what comes to mind immediately are the 4 5th century buildings of the Athenian Acropolis. Oh dear.
You need the right arrow to go forward, Stavros. Yep, that one.
Okay. The Parthenon, the Propylaia, the Temple of Athena Nike, and the Erechtheion, constructed mainly of fine pentelic marble. And here we see shots of them as they appear today. Buildings, which, although in ruins, have assumed an entirety of their own as potent cultural icons. We recognize that even in their so clearly less than complete state, they perfectly encapsulate a view of the Greek past, albeit one that is open to various interpretations. They stand at the very threshold of our appreciation and understanding of the Greek present with the past. This is not a new phenomenon. Possibly the clearest assertion of the role that Greece's antiquities played in the construction of a present was made in a speech delivered in 1834 by Leo von Klenze, the court architect and head of the construction service of the Kingdom of Bavaria. Von Klenze pronounced the following words to the Bavarian prince and recently appointed king of Greece, Otto, whom we see here being officially welcomed to Athens. So, as Otto was seated on a throne in the olive, myrtle, and laurel festooned Parthenon, flanked by Greek and German dignitaries, and apparently members of the Athenian population, von Klenze pronounced, "Your Majesty stepped today, after so many centuries of barbarism, for the first time on this celebrated Acropolis, proceeding on the road of civilization and glory, on the road paved by the likes of Themistocles, Aristides, Cicero, and Pericles. And this is and should be in the eyes of your people the symbol of your glorious reign. All the remains of barbarity will be removed, here as in all of Greece, and the remains of the glorious past will be brought in a new light as the solid foundation of a glorious present and future." Von Klenze's speech, delivered in German, so incomprehensible to the vast majority of the Greeks present, one would think, nicely underlines the complex relationship between 19th century and subsequent Greece and the country's antiquities. The establishment of the nation-state of Greece will allow the ancient monuments of the land to be resuscitated, and this process will enable the Greeks themselves to assume their proper position in the modern world. This is a theme which has had a long history, and it is one which we will follow in this presentation with the Athenian Acropolis as our major focus, though we shall look at some other antiquities briefly as well. However, before you reach the 19th century and the steps taken to care for the Acropolis's classical buildings, it is necessary to understand how these monuments reached the ruinous state they were in by the 1820s, after the peak of Athenian power in the 5th century BC. For centuries, the temples, service buildings, monuments, statues, and the like on the Acropolis retained their splendor and attracted visitors from throughout the Greco-Roman world. Though it must be said that the famous gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos, created by Pericles' preferred artistic director, Vrasidas, had already been robbed of its gold by the early 3rd century BC, by the Athenian strongman Laurantus, so that he could pay his mercenaries. He also removed the precious metals and any other valuable components from the many votive dedications on the Acropolis. It appears that thereafter, the Athenians and visitors to the Acropolis had to be content with gilded bronze in place of the original Periclean gold. Nonetheless, Athens retained its pull as a cultural and educational powerhouse for centuries, and the fabric of the Acropolis survived, although minor alterations could be made, such as the relabeling of statues of past dignitaries so as to honor current Roman movers and shakers. We must remember that sites of iconic importance are also always locations where the display of realpolitik is played out with the intention that power relationships can be negotiated to the commissioner's perceived benefit, and the Athenian Acropolis could definitely be a site of iconic importance. It appears that the first major damage to the Acropolis buildings took place in the 3rd century AD, and it has been suggested that this was a result of the invasion of the Greek peninsula by the Germanic tribe known as the Herulians in 267. The Herulians definitely sacked the lower town of Athens, but it is not certain that they broke through the Acropolis's defenses. Nonetheless, at some time in this wider period, the Parthenon was severely damaged by fire. And here I must note the inestimable contribution made by Manolis Kores to our understanding of the Acropolis. This and other drawings, which I'll show, are his. There is good evidence for the damage caused on the surviving building, and it is clear that after the conflagration, the internal colonnade of the temple's main chamber, the one to the east, where the statue of Athena stood, was restored using columns from a building located in the lower town, which may have been rendered unusable by the Herulians. The Parthenon's western doorway, seen here in a photograph taken in the 1870s, when the Parthenon clearly was in a far more ruinous state, was repaired with marble repurposed from votive, commemorative, and funerary monuments that vary from classical to Roman in date, which the Athenians cannibalized from various locations in and around the now semi-destroyed city. The temple also acquired new roof beams. Reworked monolithic columns from a destroyed or dismantled building were used for this purpose. So the damage the building sustained in the 3rd century AD was very significant. Of course, a new roof was also required. It was more steeply pitched than the original roof and was comprised of terracotta rather than marble tiles. Furthermore, it did not extend to the peristyle. That is, it did not cover the colonnade which surrounded the central building. Clearly, the Parthenon was changing. Notably, Phidias' famed, even in its reduced circumstances, statue of Athena Parthenos must have been consumed by this 3rd century fire. Remains on the eastern chamber's floor of bolt holes of a statue pedestal base indicate that it was replaced by a smaller representation of the goddess, which we assume remained in place until the Parthenon ceased to serve as her temple. In 397, the Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree which prohibited the old religion, and in 438, his grandson Theodosius II decreed that pagan temples had to close. There is, though, evidence that the decree wasn't enforced uniformly throughout the empire. Nonetheless, polytheistic Athens received a further blow in 529 when Justinian closed the city's philosophical schools. It is unknown when precisely the temple was converted to a church, but it would remain a church for nigh on 1,000 years, though after the Fourth Crusade of 1204 and the subsequent establishment of Western European ruling dynasties in various Greek lands, it served as a Latin cathedral. Little, unfortunately, is preserved of the Parthenon as a church, but some elements have been identified, and traces of murals have been recorded along with crosses and graffiti carved into the building stones, as well as mosaic tesserae from its now lost ornamentation. The conversion of the temple into a church required, of course, some alterations, the major one of which was the reorientation of the building. I suspect that it is little realized by the many visitors to the Acropolis today that as we approach the temple from the Propylaia, we actually look upon what would have been the back facade of the temple. The front in antiquity looked eastwards. The requirements of Christian worship meant that the apse of the church had to be set in the eastern wall. So along with the two originally separate chambers being connected through 3 doors, opened in the party wall, the west served as the entrance of the church, and of course the apse was added to the east. In addition to this, a tower was built in the southwest corner. Furthermore, at some unknown stage, walls were built between most of the exterior columns, so altering the appearance of the building quite radically. What are the other buildings of the Acropolis? How did they fare through the centuries? The Erechtheion, which was the site of the holiest shrine of the ancient Acropolis, where the statue of Athena Polias, Athena as defender of the city, was housed, was also converted to a church in the Byzantine period. Under Western rule, after the Fourth Crusade, it served as the residence of the Latin bishop and probably housed a chapel as well. We are in the dark as to the purpose or purposes to which the Temple of Athena Nike was put, though a crypt was dug underneath it, possibly in the early Byzantine period, and it may have served as a tomb. There is slightly more information about the Propylaia. This building also was remodeled in subsequent centuries and eventually lost its role as a ceremonial gateway to the Acropolis. At least by the late 12th century, before the arrival of the Latins of the Fourth Crusade, the north wing served as the residence of Athens's bishop Michael Choniatis, and another section was reconfigured as a chapel dedicated to the archangels, a very appropriate dedication given the location of the chapel at the one and only entrance point to the fortress of Athens. And of course, the archangels were often visualized as armed protectors. In 1395, Niccolo da Martoni from Capua visited Athens, and it appears from his written account that the Propylaia's central passageway was still open. When Cyriaco di Pizzicoli of Ancona, a trader with an infinite interest in antiquities and whose surviving diaries and notes are still very much worth consulting, visited in 1436 and again in 1444, he found that the building's central core had been transformed into the Duke's reception hall and that a mezzanine floor had been added. Access to the Acropolis was now realized through an entrance to the south of the Propylaia, adjacent to the medieval tower. And somewhere within the Propylaia, there was a chapel to San Bartolomeo. Even earlier, it appears that the northern wing of the building had been reconfigured into a double-storied residence. In effect, by the 15th century, and probably considerably earlier, the Propylaia had taken on the appearance of a medieval fortified stronghold. The approach to the Acropolis, which the Ottomans would have encountered in 1456, would have looked something like this reconstruction by Tassos Tanoulas, who has contributed a great deal to our knowledge of the post-antique Acropolis. The Ottomans did not, though, need to fight for its possession, as the last Duke of Athens saw the writing on the wall and surrendered to the Sultan's forces. Mehmed II himself visited Athens in 1458, 2 years after the Ottomans took the city. Of course, the Ottomans converted the Church of the Virgin, what had been the Parthenon, into a mosque. Beyond the addition of a minaret and a mihrab to indicate to the devout the direction of Mecca, the building was equipped with other fittings required for the functioning of a mosque. Few other major alterations can be documented, though. In most Ottoman documents, such as cadastral registers, the Parthenon is rather pedestrianly referred to as the mosque of the city of the citadel of Athens, the Jami Ikale Athena. However, praise for this most irregular mosque is also known in Ottoman texts, foremost so in the writings of Evliya Çelebi, an Ottoman traveller who left a monumental record of his travels that stretched from Iran to Amsterdam. He visited Athens in the mid-1630s and wrote an account of the Parthenon, describing it as a brilliant ancient building that is rightly renowned, particularly praising its method of construction and its architectural sculptures, along with noting how well an appointed mosque it is. And he was not the only Ottoman to hold the building in high regard. The appreciation of the Parthenon was not a monopoly of Europeans alone, though the Ottomans did place it and ancient Athens more broadly, along with Plato and Aristotle, into a different historical context, one centered heavily on the Quran, in which Solomon plays a leading role. Indeed, in the 18th century, a local jurist, Mahmud Effendi, wrote a history of Athens, which he entitled, in translation of course, The History of the City of Philosophers. He depended heavily on an earlier history entitled Old and Very Useful Histories of the Famous City of Athens by a former bishop of the city, Grigorios Kondaris, that had been published in Venice in 1676, as well as on information offered to him by contemporary local churchmen, though Mahmud Effendi reworked the information so gained into a framework, a worldview for which the Quran served as its base. Of course, it was during the 17th century that the Parthenon suffered its greatest destruction, when the larger part of the structure was destroyed, along with a great deal of its sculptures, all as a result of one of the many wars fought between the Venetian Republic and the Ottoman Empire. Thankfully for us, prior to this, in 1634, Louis XIV's newly appointed ambassador to Constantinople, the Marquis de Nointel, paid a visit to Athens in order to admire the town's antiquities, and in his entourage was an artist who undertook to document some of the sites. He is probably to be identified as Jacques Charest, who did paint this painting. As an ambassador to the Sultan's court, de Nointel was allowed to visit the Acropolis, a military zone we should not forget. One, especially a European, couldn't simply just saunter up to and knock on the front door and expect to be let in. De Nointel's position did allow him to enter the Ottoman Calais and his artist to draw the ancient temple's architectural sculptures. We ought to be very grateful for this, and that the drawings have survived, given that a few decades later, in 1687, Francesco Morosini's gunners scored a direct hit on the Parthenon. The Ottomans, so the written sources tell us, believed that the Westerners held the Parthenon in such higher regard that they couldn't conceive of the idea that they would target it. So the defenders stored their gunpowder within the building, and the upper echelons of the Ottoman garrison, along with their families, took refuge there as well. The Ottomans, of course, in this instance, were mistaken. The Venetians did take Athens, including the Acropolis, but only held it until 1690, though the damage had been done to the Parthenon and other buildings on the Acropolis. Our knowledge of the fate of the other ancient buildings during the Ottoman period is patchy. We know that the Propylaia became the offices and living quarters of the Ottoman garrison commander, the Distar Aga, and that in 1640, gunpowder stored in part of the complex exploded after being hit by lightning, thus causing further damage. The building, however, suffered more damage yet from Morosini's bombardment. In the late Ottoman period, at least, the Erechtheion was used to house the Distar Aga's harem, though it is unknown for how long it had been used for this purpose. The Temple of Nike had a totally different fate. Between 1456 and the 1680s, we do not know how it was used, though its crypt was utilized as another gunpowder store. In 1686, on the Venetian approach, the garrison commander decided to dismantle the temple and build its stones into the Acropolis defenses, specifically into cannon batteries. And here we see such batteries, and we look out towards the Piraeus and the Salamis, and then the Peloponnese beyond it. Remarkably, the inclusion of the Temple of Athena Nike's masonry into these cannon batteries preserved the temple. And as we shall see, it was able to be resurrected in the 19th century. As we saw, the Venetians soon withdrew from Athens, as it did not serve their strategic purposes to hold it. In the following years, the Acropolis developed into the garrison village, of which a number of paintings and drawings have been preserved from the early 19th century. And it is to this period that the most evident indication of the Ottoman period could be seen up to a few years ago on the Acropolis, though it has been removed from where it once was located near the Erechtheion. It is an inscription which was carved onto a block from that temple in 1708 or 1709, and it would have been placed above one of the gateways one had to pass through in order to enter the Acropolis. My English translation from a Greek translation published in 1889 reads, "This high fortification was built as a bulwark against the eyes of the enemies. Everybody who enters and visits it naturally praises it. The wish of the voivoda of this city, Mustafa Effendi, has granted to this fine structure great and exceptional value, because indeed the value of this is clearly evident to all. It is fitting that he who brought this to pass be remembered both by his superiors and his inferiors. This strong fortification was built so that those with knowledge of fortifications who see it will exclaim, 'May God bless this stronghold.'" This Ottoman inscription reminds us in no uncertain terms that the Acropolis was a military zone, one which was closed to Western travelers unless they could, at least officially, secure the necessary paperwork from the imperial capital. It is also worth remembering that Athens in the early 19th century was a town with a population of between 10,000 and 12,000 people. As mentioned earlier, the military commander of the Acropolis was the Distar Aga, but the city was governed by the voivoda, the official actually mentioned in this inscription. It was, of course, in these very years that an increasing amount of antiquities started to be removed from Greek lands. Lord Elgin, and here we see his agents in action, pretty much monopolizes popular knowledge as the greatest of these removers, but there were many more, and not all of them were Western Europeans. For Russian forces too were accused of taking and destroying antiquities, particularly in the Cyclades, during the Russo-Turkish War of 1770-74. But the prize does go to the Western Europeans. A prime example of the attitude is provided in the correspondence of the Comte de Choiseul-Gouffier, who was appointed the ambassador of France to Constantinople in 1784. The Count wrote to his agent in Athens, Louis-François Sébastien Favel, quote, "Take all you can Do not neglect any opportunity to pillage whatever can be pillaged in Athens and its surroundings. Spare neither the dead nor the living." End of quote. Fauvel, who had originally been sent to Athens ostensibly to make plaster casts of antiquities, soon became a conduit through which the antiquities left Greece, including the pieces of sculpture from the Parthenon currently in the Louvre. He also amassed a notable collection of his own, with which he is pictured here. Indeed, Fauvel became a fixture in Athens, both for foreigners and Greeks who wished to learn about the city's ancient past. He was apparently something of a walking encyclopedia. His legacy, as we shall see, was long-lived, though he was not particularly well disposed to the Greek uprising, and eventually relocated to Smyrna, Izmir, where he lived the rest of his life. Choiseul-Gouffier, unlike his agent, died before the Greek Revolution broke out, but he, in contrast, went into print in 1782, advocating the Greek cause in his luxurious folio volumes of the Voyage pittoresque de la Grèce. The first years of the 19th century saw Elgin's removal of a large number of antiquities from Athens and Attica, including a very significant amount of the Parthenon sculptures. And here we see an image of the temple created by his agent, Giovanni Battista Lucieri. Elgin's actions have been much debated, and I shall not enter into the issue now, but I will simply point out that it was condemned by far more individuals than Lord Byron alone. Arguably, the most acerbic of these critics was a certain Edward Clarke, who penned on the 31st of October, 1801, the opinion that "I must lament the plan pursued by the agents of Lord Elgin in this place. Under the pretense of rescuing the arts from the hands of the Turks, they are pulling down temples that have withstood the injuries of time and war and barbarism for ages, to adorn a miserable Scotch villa." End of quote. Edward Dodwell, the antiquary and artist who has provided us with a number of views of Athens, which we have seen in this presentation, was more succinct. Elgin's agent's removal of the Parthenon marbles was a devastating outrage which will never cease to be deplored. Writing on another of Elgin's removals, that of the statue of Dionysus from Thrasylos' monument on the south side of the Acropolis, Dodwell simply penned, "barbarously removed to London." And here we see a reconstruction of that monument, which was done by two other artists whom Elgin employed. Edward Clarke's view of Elgin's activities are of particular interest to us now, for he too was not adverse to collecting cultural artifacts from Greek lands. Indeed, Clarke had a particularly successful career in removing manuscripts from Greek monasteries, especially from that of St. John the Theologian on Patmos, but from other islands as well. In Clarke's mind, his actions were justified as his acquisitions were intended for educational purposes back in Cambridge, whereas Elgin's were intended to simply decorate his own private residence. Nonetheless, it was Clarke's activities which led Adamantios Karalis to protest in 1807. He clearly was not impressed by Clarke's rationale. From his base in Paris, where he had become the leading advocate for a Greek Renaissance, if not immediate revolution, Karalis circulated his view that the Greeks had to persuade the Europeans that, quote, "we do not gift nor any longer sell our ancestral possessions," end of quote. In this particular instance, Karalis' attention was focused on manuscripts, a reflection of his own speciality in ancient literature, but he clearly vocalized an attitude which was naturally extended to all material remains. Not content to remain on a theoretical level, Karalis prepared a plan to protect monasteries' manuscripts collections, a plan which included provision for the establishment of a Greek museum that would include all categories of artifacts from ancient Greece, which still remained in Greek lands. He submitted his proposal to the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Holy Synod, a good decade before the outbreak of the Greek Revolution. Adamantios Korais was not the only Greek who believed that the future of the Greeks lay with a meaningful re-engagement with their ancient past. The cleric Meletios of Ioannina, nearly a century earlier, for example, stated in his book, Old and New Geography, that Greeks should study the ancient remains as this would provide evidence of continuity. Far more recently, Fani Maria Tsigakou summed up the situation well when she wrote that ordinary Greeks may not have been obsessed, like the intelligentsia, with ancient Greece, but it was becoming ever more relevant to them, as indicated by the increasing use of ancient names, historical and mythological, both for individuals as well as for ships in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In this vein, the Philomusos Eteria was founded in Athens in September 1813 by locals and resident foreigners. Its constitutional articles spelled out the members' goals, which included the discovery of antiquities, the collection of inscriptions, the establishment of a museum which would be open to the public, and the education of the youth. Shortly thereafter, the Philomusos Eteria issued a statement in which it stated that the antiquities throughout Greece were its sacred concern. The practical impact of the Eteria was not overwhelming, but it did promote interest in and education about the monuments. And in 1820, it undertook the first conservation project on the Temple of Hephaestus and Athena, often misidentified as the Thesion, specifically the stabilization of a column that had been struck by lightning. And here we see the temple in a vignette which we may not immediately think of when we try to imagine late Ottoman Athens. In effect, we see a carnival scene where a trapeze artist is performing. Clearly in this period, a new appreciation of the remains of the ancient world, one instilled with values akin to those of Western Europe, but with a local timbre, was gaining ground. In many Greek quarters, it was thought that their links with antiquity would successfully set them apart from other peoples within the Ottoman Empire, and their renaissance, and more importantly, the armed insurrection which will cement it, would be one that set them in their proper place as a nation. It would not be a radical revolution, which would test or threaten the established order so dear to the great powers, and they planned to sell it in this light to the capitals that mattered. Famously, 1821 saw the outbreak of the revolution, and on the 1st of January 1822, the National Assembly at Epidavros declared the existence and independence of the Greek state, though many bloody years had to pass before this actually became an internationally recognized reality. Throughout the revolution's course, various representative bodies of the Greek insurgents reflected an appreciation for the land's antiquities in the formation of their embryonic nation state. The Gerousia of Eastern Greece in 1822, for instance, decreed that its director of politics was responsible for the protection of antiquities. In February 1825, the Interior Minister, Grigorios Dikeos, also known as Papaflessas, ordered the overseer of education to ensure that antiquities should be collected in schools, so that each school would have its own museum, so minimizing European criticism that Greeks were selling their antiquities abroad for a pittance. The rationale, of course, reveals the fact that despite official attempts, the antiquities market was still flourishing, and it was still legal for locals to sell antiquities. In 1826, the Provisional Administration, the government of the insurgent Greeks, issued an order for the securing and protection of the antiquities of Athens and wider Attica, decreeing that these remains are national, and it proceeded to demolish 4 workshops in order to protect and reveal more of Hadrian's library in Athens. And here we see the facade of the library as it appeared 20-odd years earlier. At this very period, the commander of the Greek forces on the Athenian Acropolis, Ioannis Kouras, commissioned J.F. Besson to prepare a plan of all of Athens' antiquities. And in the following year, in dark times for the Greek cause, the provisional administration ordered that antiquities were not to be sold or transported overseas. As regards plans of Athens of the period, one which focuses on military installations in infrastructure prepared by the Ottoman forces in the 1820s has recently come to light, in 1827 actually, and it's come to light in the state archives in Istanbul. It has not been definitively published as yet, but when it is, I am certain that our knowledge of Athens in this period will be enriched. Its very existence and its emphasis on military installations underscores the seriousness of the operations in Athens undertaken by both sides in this very period. Needless to say, most of the decisions and decrees of the Greek collective bodies were rather theoretical in nature. Circumstances on the ground were difficult, and the sway of various issuing authorities was not universal. One may question how they would have been practically applied. Though there are instances, such as when Alexandros Mavrokordatos, a leading insurgent, informed Colonel Bernard Rotiers, who was actively seeking antiquities, especially on Milos as it turned out, that the export of all antiquities was forbidden. All the while, of course, hostilities were taking place. During the 1821-22 Greek siege of the Athenian Acropolis, where the Ottoman garrison was resisting, the provisional administration, it is reported, asked the Philhellene artillery commander, a certain Colonel Vautier, to respect the ancient monuments as he fired his ordnance at the Acropolis. Indeed, a persistent story about the attitude of some Greeks regarding their antiquities revolves around Kyriakos Pitakis, a local Athenian who had been a student of the Philomusos Eteria and of the Frenchman Fauvel, whom we met earlier, and whom Pitakis credited later in life for teaching him a great deal. At the outbreak of the revolution, Pitakis was in his early 20s and participated in the first siege of the Acropolis, during which he is said to have convinced his fellow combatants to supply the Ottomans with lead to use as bullets so that they would not further dismantle the ancient buildings to remove the lead which encased the iron clamps that kept the marble blocks together. And here I show one of these marble blocks and the lead encasement. An alternative view relates the version that Pitakis convinced his fellow Greeks not to destroy antiquities for this purpose. Either way, Pitakis' commitment to the material remains of the ancient past was solid. The Ottomans surrendered the Acropolis in 1822 owing to a lack of water. It was thanks to Pitakis and his knowledge of the ancient texts that the Greeks rediscovered the ancient Clepsydra, a source of fresh water just to the northwest corner of the foot of the Acropolis. On its discovery, Odysseus and Routsos quickly incorporated it into the fortification system. So there are clearly practical applications that can flow from archaeological research. When the Greeks had to surrender the fortress to the Ottomans in 1827, after a 12-month siege that saw all of the Acropolis monuments subjected to brutal bombardment, it wasn't for a lack of drinking water. In the latter years of the revolution, Pitakis actually undertook excavations in Athens. He dug at the Kerameikos and at the Temple of Hephaestus and Athena and the Library of Hadrian, which is visible behind the Sidaraki Mosque in the lower image on your screens. He also dug at the Tower of the Winds and at Lysicrates' monument. To jump ahead for a moment, it is interesting to note that in 1859, Pitakis excavated his own house, which had been destroyed in the first year of the revolution, at the corner of modern Ermou and Pitaki streets, and so retrieved the antiquities he had stored there in the years leading up to 1821. The Third National Assembly at Troezen in 1827, at which we saw it was decreed that the antiquities could not be sold or sent abroad, also elected Ioannis Kapodistrias as the governor of Greece. We should remember that at this stage, Greece still had not been recognized by any international power. On his arrival on the island of Aegina in 1828, Kapodistrias established an orphanage which also included a collection of antiquities, referred to as the National Museum, and he too declared that antiquities could not be exported. The Fourth National Assembly in 1829 certified this policy. However, the complications of realpolitik become blatantly apparent at this point. Kapodistrias and the Assembly decided that it was advisable that the French Expedition Scientifique des Morais, an archaeological expedition which investigated the Peloponnese and a number of islands in 1829, be allowed to remove to France a number of ancient marvels from Olympia. It was clearly diplomatic to keep France on side. It was obvious to all that the material testimonies to Greece's ancient past had a value which could be realized in various ways. In this vein, Kapodistrias suggested in 1831 that Greece donate some antiquities to Bavaria in exchange for books, teaching instruments, and school aids. On founding the National Museum, Kapodistrias appointed the Courfiet, Andreas Mustoxidis, as its director. Mustoxidis was a firm believer in the educational potential of Greece's ancient past, and he decreed that excavations could only take place with the state's permission. Though the state, such as it was not always committed to its pronounced principles. In 1828 and 1829, the government destroyed parts of the Temple of Apollo on the island of Aegina in order to build the foundations of a quay, the orphanage, and other public buildings. And the attitudes of its functionaries were not always what we would expect today. For example, in 1829, a priest from the island of Kea donated 2 statues he dearly cherished to the Museum on Aegina. In a letter to the Secretary for Church Affairs and Public Education, Mustoxidis states that the statues were not worth the effort expended on them, fragmentary and damaged as they were, and that this should be a lesson that they should not accept donations for having seen them. So clearly, criteria have come a long way as referring to museum collections than what they were in the 1820s. In September 1831, Kapodistrias was assassinated, but before this, by the London Protocol of 1830, Greece had been recognized by the great powers as an independent and sovereign state, and by 1832, the borders had been set. Mustoxidis left his position in mid-1832. The same year, Pitakis was made responsible for the antiquities of Athens, and he was the first person to undertake excavations, albeit limited, on the Acropolis in 1833. The scene was very fluid. The Ottoman garrison on the Acropolis had only left in April of that year, and here we see an image of the Acropolis and the Temple of Olympian Zeus, taken only a few years later. The newly appointed and still underage, and so under the tutelage of regents, King of Greece, Otto of Bavaria, arrived early in 1833. In July, Athens was declared the capital, and in December 1834, Otto officially arrived in Athens, and one of the columns of the Parthenon was ceremoniously restored. The Bavarian regency had its own plans for the care of Greece's antiquities. And here I must note that our knowledge and appreciation of the restoration of ancient monuments in Greece for the following century owes a great deal to the research of Fanny Malouchou Tufano. In 1833, the architect Adolf Weisenberg was initially appointed as the head of a service for the preservation of archaeological discoveries, with 3 subordinates, each with their area of operations: Kyriakos Pitakis for Central Greece, Ioannis Kokonis for the Aegean Islands, and Ludwig Ross for the Peloponnese. This archaeological service, from 1836 headed by Pitakis, was underfunded and understaffed. A number of private individuals, with encouragement from Pitakis, founded the Archaeological, the Archaeological Society of Athens, on the Acropolis in 1837, in order to support the state's efforts in excavation and preservations of antiquities. And it has contributed an incredible amount to archaeological research in the country over the past 164 years, as indeed has the Archaeological, the state archaeological service. The Acropolis was, of course, the center of attention. We are today very familiar with it as an archaeological site, and indeed, it was Greece's first site open to the public in 1835, and yes, an entrance fee was charged. However, the future of the Acropolis as an archaeological site was not a foregone conclusion. Some wanted it to remain a garrison fortification, and the area could even be imagined as the site for a royal palace set amongst the classical ruins, as seen in these drawings by Carl Friedrich Schinkel. And what is indicated in this plan in black, of course, are the ancient buildings, the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the Propylaia, and everything else would have been a palace had it ever been built. But it was decided to transform it into an archaeological park, and that all post-classical remains be removed. The last of which was a medieval tower, which was dismantled in 1875 at Heinrich Schliemann's expense. And in the upper photograph, you see the tower still in situ, and then a few decades later, it's no longer there. In 1835 and 1836, Ludwig Rost, with the help of other Athens-based European architects, re-erected the Temple of Athena Nike, the masonry of which had been incorporated by the Ottomans into the artillery emplacements in 1687. And here you can see it restored. This was the first complete restoration of any classical monument in Europe. In the same period, Sergeant B.K. Heller cleaned various sculptures and made casts of them. With an eye to the preservation of the classical monuments, conservators were brought from Switzerland and Italy in the 1836 and 1837, though only one remained until 1844. During all these undertakings, the classical antiquities were the focus. In the 1840s and 50s, later remains were demolished and their stones sold off as building material so as to fund excavations and conservation. More broadly, an indication of the early focus on classical antiquities alone is that a director for Christian and medieval antiquities was only appointed in 1910, though it must be said the first restoration of a Byzantine monument took place in 1893, when work was undertaken on the magnificent mosaics at the monastery at Daphne. Nonetheless, in many cases, post-classical antiquities were only saved if powerful individuals intervened, and many, such as the 12th century church of the Archangel Michael, built against an exterior wall of the Library of Hadrian, were lost forever. And all that remains of this church are some remnants of its murals. Despite the fact that the government in 1836 decreed that monuments of the Byzantine, Venetian, and Turkish periods be preserved, this too often was not the case. Furthermore, plans in the 1830s to expropriate large parts of Athens north of the Acropolis, which had been heavily inhabited prior to the revolution, so as to create an archaeological park, were strenuously resisted. As the press of the day shows, Athenians protested that they would lose their homes and properties for no better reason than the unearthing of antiquities. In May 1834, the Bavarian regency passed its first archaeological law, which focused primarily on portable antiquities and the illicit antiquity trade, though it did indirectly refer to the necessity to protect ancient monuments from wanton destruction and for measures to stabilize them in balance with the rights of private ownership. On the Acropolis, there weren't any private property owners, so matters on this regard were more straightforward. Von Klenze's 1838 view of the restoration of the buildings was based on the rationale that these monuments can be saved for the future and to show to Europe that the young king of Greece and the regency are far more interested in them than the tired management exercised by some public servants indicates. It was in 1834 and 1835 that the demolition of the fortifications and removal of ruinous other buildings began in earnest under the supervision of Ludwig Ross. This also included the removal of the remains of the Christian apse, which had been added to the Parthenon. Actual reconstruction of the temple began in 1835, though it was very limited. Where wall blocks were missing or very damaged, they were replaced with new ones of porous limestone, a totally alien stone to the original Pentelic marble, and a practice not countenanced today. Ruinous columns were provided with new drums, which remained unfluted. Many repositioned marble blocks were not placed in their original positions. They were often positioned upside down or back to front. It is clear that the knowledge of Greek architecture was very much still in its infancy. And the fact that there was a shortage of skilled marble workers, as the workers from Tinos had been seconded to work on the royal palace, did not help matters. During this period, the remains of the medieval palace in the Propylaia were removed, and excavations were conducted around the Erechtheion and the Parthenon. Pitakis also raised by 6 courses the Erechtheion south wall and repositioned the 4th caryatid. In truth, given the limited resources, progress along the chosen path of focusing on the 5th century BC buildings was slow. In the 1840s, more work was undertaken on the Parthenon, including the removal of the cistern along its western facade, which revealed its 12 steps, as well as the removal of the post-1687 mosque within the temple itself. In these early restoration programs, a leading role was played by the Archaeological Society, which produced restoration studies for the Acropolis, but also for the Vrasidas monument, which we saw earlier, and other antiquities beyond Athens. In 1842, Alexandros Radavis, president of the society, stated at a meeting held in the Parthenon, "We are gathering every stone of the Parthenon as though it were a diamond, every fragment a relic, and erecting one of those machines around it to resurrect it, using the very same scaffolds Lord Elgin employed to take the temple apart. And let Europe, as witness to our deeds, judge whose efforts are nobler and more deserving of her sympathy and aid. And as a formal protest against its desecration, we shall resurrect it from its surviving ruins today, as we have resurrected free ancient Greece from its surviving remains." And indeed, the restoration of the Parthenon was progressing slowly, albeit, with the raising of more columns. In 1844, the British Museum was asked to send casts of various pieces from the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena Nike, and the one caryatid in London, and some of these were incorporated into the buildings. Meanwhile, the Legation de France funded Alexis Paccard's restoration of the south porch of the Erechtheion. Paccard used a block from the Parthenon, clearly a totally unacceptable practice nowadays, in his restoration, along with totally new marble. In the early 1850s, Karl Böttlicher excavated the Erechtheion to bedrock. So what post-antique accretions had survived, as seen in this drawing, were definitively removed. And in 1850, the Archaeological Society undertook the major task of restoring the stairway that leads up to the Propylaia. Pitakis died in 1863. During the years he oversaw the restoration programs on the Acropolis, there was no sustained attempt to place ancient material in its original position, and unworked supplementary blocks and brick were used to stabilize the monuments. These years represent the very early stages of a learning process, and appropriately trained personnel was still lacking. It was in this period, though, that the value of Greece's antiquities, especially those of the Athenian Acropolis and foremost the Parthenon, on the international diplomatic scene can be seen. And this story takes us, somewhat unexpectedly, to the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. In 1852, the Washington National Monument Society invited states and associations that admired George Washington to contribute blocks inscribed with the appropriate sentiments to be included within the monument. Not only did Greece decide to send such a commemorative plaque, but this stone would come from the Parthenon itself, a building which exuded a great degree of cultural capital. The inscription on the deceptively simple stone reads, in translation, "To George Washington, the hero, the citizen of a new and illustrious liberty, the land of Solon, Themistocles and Pericles, the mother of ancient liberty, sends this ancient stone as a testimony of honor and admiration." The stone's origins and the text it carries, which refers to the great men of Athens' past, had the possibility of resonating with US decision makers of the day, given their education. And it was probably with this hope, though it is not known if it was fulfilled in any way, that Greece decided to send an element of the Parthenon to a foreign land at the same time as many of its citizens were protesting the removal to the United Kingdom of other elements of the same temple. The Greek Parthenon stone takes its place today alongside approximately another 200, and I show it in all its simplicity in a photograph with its counterpart sent by the Ottoman Sultan. Though to return to the Acropolis, in 1878, the Archaeological Society restored some of its south retaining wall, using stones from the demolished medieval tower and other medieval structures. Unlike in the earlier restorations of the Acropolis buildings, there wasn't any distinction made between the new material and the ancient, and emphasis was clearly placed on providing an impression on how the wall appeared in antiquity. It was in the 1880s that the Archaeological Society initiated large-scale systematic excavations, which lasted until 1900 on the Acropolis under the directorship of Panagiotis Kavadias, with the German Georg Kavarau as architect. It was during these campaigns that the 6th century BC sculptures and architectural elements, along with a great deal more, was excavated. In here, I just show a very small selection of these pieces. They had been buried in the fill which lay between the Acropolis's encircling walls and the natural outcrop which forms its spine. An indication of the depth of the fill in some places can be seen in this photograph that shows the excavation which revealed the depth, 11 meters, of the basis on which the Parthenon stands. And you might be able to make out in the bottom right 2 humans, which can act as a scale. As these excavations were progressing, in 1894, an earthquake shook Athens and elements of the Parthenon fell to the ground. It was clear that major interventions were required, and these were undertaken under the direction of Kavadias and the architect Nikolaos Balanos. It was also recognized that the world would be watching, so the Prime Minister and Cabinet were in contact with foreign experts, and decisions went to a special committee of specialists certified by the Cabinet. Work only began in 1897 after the 1896 Olympics and Greece's defeat by the Ottoman Empire in the brief war of 1897. Undoubtedly, from our vantage point today, there are many aspects of this restoration conservation program which would not be approved, such as the use of cement and iron clamps, albeit the latter encased in lead. There was extensive use of new marble to supplement original elements in order to maximize the amount of the temple that could be restored. The work took years, and there were, of course, complaints in the press, but it was completed in 1902. And we gained one unexpected insight into these works by the souvenirs, if we can call them that the workmen left, indicating the traces of their activities, their names, and an engraved crucifix. Balanos's work, though, was not done. From 1899 and into the first years of the 20th century, he repaired parts of the Acropolis's east and north walls, as well as the bastion on which the Temple of Athena Nike stands. Elsewhere on the Acropolis, major restoration work was undertaken intermittently on the Erechtheion between 1895 and 1909 by Panagiotis Kavadias, Nikolaos Balanos, and Willem Derpfeld, with the aim of restoring it to the state it had been before the intervention of Elgin's agents and the damage it had suffered during the revolution. This involved restoring the west facade to how it would have appeared during the Roman period. And here you can see on the upper image is a photograph taken before the restoration and the bottom image after the restoration. And on the south side of the temple, 4 courses were raised on its walls. And again, you can see the difference before and after. In 1909, the same individuals turned their attention to the Propylaia, starting with the eastern facade, and note there isn't a trace of its pediment, and they re-erected fallen elements and ordered the creation of new ones where needed from the quarries of Mount Pendeli. And this is the result of their actions. Anastasios Orlandos, who was to play a leading role in archaeological restorations for many decades to come, joined the team in 1912. But Balanos was the major player, and from 1911, the Propylaia restoration program bore his signature. And many of the techniques he adopted, such as the reshaping and refitting of fragments of 4 different column capitals into one, or his use of cement and iron clamps, have subsequently attracted wide criticism, though at the time he also had his admirers. In 1910, the Greek state established its first public service, specifically dedicated to the conservation and restoration of antiquities. And this was further enhanced in 1920 to the Office for the Reconstruction and Conservation of Ancient Monuments. It was a member of this service that Nikolaos Balanos undertook the second and most extensive restoration program of the Parthenon between 1922 and 1933, but this lies beyond this presentation. The concern, care, and restoration, or lack thereof, of the Acropolis monuments from 1821 through to 1921 cannot be approached in isolation. As I hope has become clear, the topic should be seen as one element in a far longer history of this, for us and many others, iconic location, and it is better understood when we also look further afield to what was happening in the first instance elsewhere in Athens. The decision to highlight the 5th century buildings that were so closely associated with the name of Pericles suited both the Greek revolutionaries as well as the state once it had been established. It also served the classically trained foreign historians and archaeologists well, and possibly even some of the politicians back in their home countries. The result is a monument that speaks to concerns far beyond those of archaeological interest alone. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this incredibly, I think, important, significant, and enlightening and inspiring, I would say, lecture throughout the centuries, the last 20 centuries, actually so many centuries, and so much to be talked about, and so much to absorb as well. So any questions? Are there any questions? Giving the vote of thanks by Father Athanasios, can I ask a more theoretical question about archaeology? I mean, that relates to what Peter before asked. When we work on the archaeological space of the Acropolis, do we want to reconstruct an ideal year of the monument? That is to say, or we show the diachronic development on the space itself? Because I thought, just for me, I'm a sort of I love the classical period, but I love medieval period. I think it's so underrated and underestimated. I would like to have seen what was happening. How was the church inside the Parthenon? What sort of iconographical types we had in the church? I mean, if you go to the Library of Hadrian in Monastiraki, you can still see some things there, right? What was the? Can we reconstruct the diachronic development of a monument, or we simply try to find, it's a theoretical question, right?
Yeah.
And or we try to find the best moment in the best period in its pristine, original, most authentic, just situation.
Yeah. I think it's clear that the Acropolis as we have it now, those who have been responsible for creating it, took the view that they were focusing on a period which they considered the best, and that's 5th century, the 5th century BC. And that view has been absorbed through osmosis, I would suspect, by most people in Greece and probably most people in Western Europe as well. That came at a price, of course, and that's inherent in your question. It's a very potent image, and this 5th century Acropolis, 5th century Parthenon, and what immediately comes to mind is if anybody's following the construction of St. Nicholas at Ground Zero in New York, they'll be aware that a great deal has been made from the fact that the marble that's being used for the construction of the church comes from the same quarries as the marble for the Parthenon. If you go on any of the websites that you can that discuss this thing, it's always at the fore. It's conceived to be a selling point, a good selling point. So, to my mind, we are broadly, most people are at this stage, still believe that this is the 5th century BC is the period. But as I said, it's come at a price. We've lost a great deal of information that we would otherwise have had if the approach was slightly different post the 1830s, and if there was a stricter documentation of the buildings that had been removed. What we know about the Parthenon as a church, for instance, which you raised, there's obviously the first place to go is the book by Anthony Calvelis on the Christian Parthenon, supplemented by a number of book reviews, of course, which make their own contribution to the topic. But theoretically, the Parthenon we have today, the Acropolis that we have today, is the creation of the view that the 5th century BC is the apex of Greek civilization, basically.
Without further ado, now I think we can go on for hours talking about this. Father Athanasios, thank you again, Stavros, on behalf of the Greek department and the students and the attendants here tonight. Thank you so much for the enlightening and inspiring lecture about the monuments on the Acropolis. And now, Father Athanasios, you give us the blessings. You bring the spiritual in us now out. Thank
you, Vras. I just wanted firstly to apologize if you hear any background music. It's we've got a neighbor who obviously, because of COVID, the restrictions, we get a lot of people at 8 o'clock deciding to come out in the balcony and start singing in loud voices and everything. That's the effects of the lockdown. So I apologize if you get any background noise. But please allow me first to convey the paternal blessings of His Eminence Archbishop Makarios of Australia to all the organizers of this very important and significant event. His Eminence apologizes for not being able to make it to tonight's event. He only just came back a few days ago, a week ago from Constantinople, and he had been in quarantine. So he's a very busy man and very difficult to talk to. But he does send his blessings, and he has informed me to let you know that once the restrictions do ease and the university is open, he's looking forward to visiting the University of Sydney, the Modern Greek Department, Professor Karalis and the Archaeological Institute, and meeting you in person, Dr. Paspalas. As well, on behalf of our parish, St. Catherine's Greek Orthodox Church in Mascot, and on behalf of Professor Vrasidas Karalis and the Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies, we would like to sincerely express our gratitude to our eminent speaker, tonight's eminent speaker, Dr. Stavros Paspalas, who spoke so well and so passionately, and I'm so blessed to have attended tonight's talk. It's part of my research, and to see all this information come out in this lecture has been for me personally a very special moment. So thank you very much, Stavros, for the wonderful presentation tonight, and as well a big thank you as well to Dr. Yvonne Ino, who helped us to coordinate this event and to organize the Eventbrite page and the online registration. Please allow me on a personal level to express personally my eternal gratitude and respect to my mentor and academic supervisor, Professor Vrasidas Karalis, who is a national treasure for all of us. He's very inspirational. And I wanted to thank you, Vras, for accepting my initial thought of organizing this event and being part of the commemorative events for the 200th year anniversary of the Greek Revolution. And what better way to celebrate this and to have a very beautiful presentation by Dr. Paspalas tonight. Finally, a big thank you to everyone for attending tonight's presentation, hopefully, and I'm hoping that Stavros, you may agree for next year when things do ease at Sydney University and we get to have a chat again at the Archaeological Institute, that we discuss maybe some future collaboration on the Byzantine and Ottoman aspect of the Acropolis. That would be very interesting to have you present on that as well. So thank you once again. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much for your kind words.
Thank you, Stavros, for all what you are doing to continue the tradition of Professor Gambitoglou. You expand it, you enrich it, you create a completely new sort of a kind of, if I may say, framework for discussions and problematizations. And on behalf of the department if I may say, of the University of Sydney and of the department, we are very grateful for your presence tonight and the incredible, inspiring lecture you gave us. And thank you all.